Okay, so welcome again to this application support session for the Heritage Awards 2023. We're starting with the Cornwall Heritage Awards guidance section. So I'm going to talk you through who can apply and what you can apply for and what the judges are going to be looking for. So we'll start with eligibility. If you're submitting an application for a piece of work, that work and activity must have taken place this year, so from the 1st of January 2022. We don't want to exclude anything. If you started a piece of work last November or December and you're worried about that, don't let that put you off. We want the bulk of the work to have happened this year. Basically, if you couldn't submit it for a Heritage Awards last year, we want to hear about it this year. If you have a large piece of work that you started last year and was only culminated this year, that's fine too. If you have any questions about that, please do ask. Your organisation must be a heritage site, museum or archive with either a heritage collection or a site that's accessible to the public. Okay. That's quite broad. There may be some grey areas. If you're not sure about whether you count as a heritage site, again, please ask. We also ask that to be eligible for a Heritage Award, you must demonstrate your commitment to inclusion and environmental sustainability. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. You may enter for more than one category. You can also enter the same piece of work for more than one category. And you may enter more than one piece of work or team or an individual for a particular category. The only one where there is a restriction is Object of the Year, and that is limited to one object per organisation. So when you're doing that, please discuss with your team members which object you want to nominate for that. Otherwise, there's quite a lot of breadth and wriggle room to make sure that you have the best chance of showing off your fantastic pieces of work and your fantastic people. If you're unsure about eligibility or you're not sure what category fits your piece of work or your people the best, drop us an email. So we've got a specific Heritage Awards email, heritageawards@cornwallmuseumspartnership.org.uk, and one of our team will get back to you as soon as possible. We are banding organisations this year into larger organisations and smaller organisations. We do not mean anything derogatory by the term smaller. We're just talking about the amount of resource available to organisations and making it as fair as possible for everybody, because we recognise there's a terrific breadth in size and resource across all the organisations in Cornwall. We're counting larger organisations as those with 2 or more full-time equivalent members of staff, or those that are managed or supported by some kind of larger structure or organisation. So if you're a National Trust site or an English Heritage site, or you're part of the NPA, then you will fall into the larger organisation band. Smaller organisations are any volunteer-run museum or an organisation that has less than two full-time equivalent members of staff. And we're excluding support staff, such as maintenance team and catering team. The awards are going to be doubled up for some categories. So for innovation, collaboration, wellbeing and healthy team, there will be an award for larger organisations and for smaller organisations. So in each of those categories, they will be shortlisted twice and there will be 2 awards made. For Heritage Heroes, Leader of the Year, Want to Watch and Object of the Year, the brilliance of your people and your object doesn't depend on the size and the resource of your organisation. So everyone will be in together and be one award for each of those. The final award is Spirit of the Awards. This isn't one that you apply for. This is an award that the judges take a view on, considering everybody's application and everybody's answers to all the questions. And again, there will be 2 awards for that. There'll be an award for a larger organisation and an award for a smaller organisation. So I just wanted to say a little bit about how the judging will work. The shortlisting for most of the categories is going to be done by professionals in the Museum Development Network. I'm the Museum Development Officer with Cornwall Museums Partnership, and I know that the MDO role takes a broad view of all the different heritage organisations. So people in the Museum Development Network are very well placed to recognise the scale of different organisations and the relative brilliance of that work. Your answers for inclusion and environmental sustainability will be scored by experts in those areas. Object of the Year is going to be shortlisted by a professional with expertise in climate change and the climate crisis. The final decisions for most of the categories will be made by a panel of judges, and that's going to be chaired by a member of the CMP board. If anything changes, when I talk about the panel of the judges, due to availability of judges or the amount of applications they have to go through, I'll update that on the website. But at the moment, I envisage it's going to be a panel of people coming together to talk about each category, decide on a winner for each category, and then decide on those Spirit of the Awards winners. And then most excitingly, the Object of the Year is going to be decided by public vote in December. So I'm just going to take you through the questions that you're going to be asked in the application. Those of you who applied last year will be delighted to know there's far less questions this year. We've really tried to simplify it based on feedback from everybody. So you're going to be asked for your organisation name. You'll be asked for contact details of somebody that we can correspond with. Please bear in mind that if you put yourself down as the main contact, it's likely that you're going to be getting quite a lot of emails from us when you're shortlisted. So please be prepared for that. You'll be asked which band you fall into. You'll be asked which category you want to apply for. As I said, you can apply for multiple different categories, but they have to be one application per form. Last year, we did allow you to choose whether you wanted to apply for more than one category at the same time. This year, when we talk about the individual requirements for each category, they will need tweaking if you want to enter the same project for a number of different categories. So you will have to do a different application for each category. And then you'll be asked for a title for the activity, and then the name of the team or the individual, and the name of the object if you're applying for Object of the Year. So I mentioned at the beginning, we are looking for your commitment to inclusion and environmental sustainability as a condition of being eligible for the Heritage Awards. And this is because at Cornwall Museums Partnership, we really believe in the role of heritage organisations to enact positive change in our society. Also, inclusion and environmental sustainability are absolutely key to the overall sustainability and resilience of your organisation. We think they're so important that we didn't want to bring them out into a separate category on their own. We want to have them running through the entirety of the Heritage Awards as our core values. Your answers for inclusion and environmental sustainability will be scored to confirm your eligibility and also contribute to the overall spirit of the awards decision-making at the end. It's really important to note that these scores are not going to be used to judge individual categories. So if you apply for the Collaboration Award, you'll be shortlisted and judged on your answer to the collaboration question, not inclusion and environmental sustainability. I just wanted to make it really clear that the people we're getting to score the inclusion and environmental sustainability understand that your answers are going to be relative to the scale of your organisation. We recognise that small changes are a big deal sometimes, and we don't want anyone to feel that their efforts are too small or too insignificant. Please write down what you've done and you'll be scored accordingly. We will expect more of those organisations that are further along their journey towards, for example, environmental sustainability, and that will be reflected in the scoring. So, for inclusion, when we talk about inclusion, we are referring back to the Heritage Fund statement of engaging more and different people with museums and their collections. In this case, I'm using museums and their collections as shorthand for heritage organisations and their sites and their collections. So please interpret that in its widest possible sense. And we're also interested in talking about creating more equitable workplaces. So this is about the work that you do outward facing, but also inwardly. There's one question. You'll have 150 words to describe what your organisation has done to become more inclusive in the last year. We're interested in progress here. Any changes that you have made to become more inclusive, that's what we want to hear about. This could be a huge variety of things that you've done. And I didn't want to give you a huge amount of examples here, just a few prompts for you to think about what you may have done that you'd like to talk about here. And that could be research and consultation with different groups of people and different collaborations. You may have made changes to policies, plans, and processes. You may have introduced new activities. You may have changed the way you do activities. You may also have found demonstrable and tangible changes to the audience that you're working with and to the makeup of your workforce. There's so many things that could have happened in the last year. We just want to hear about them. Your answer is going to be scored out of 5. Again, just to emphasise, that is purely for making sure that we can see a commitment from you and also contributing to Spirit of the Awards at the end, not for individual categories. The environmental sustainability is quite similar. We want all organisations applying to the Heritage Awards to demonstrate their commitment to tackling the climate crisis. And again, you'll have 150 words maximum to describe what your organisation has done to become more environmentally sustainable in the last year. Again, so many things that you could have done. Again, completely relative to the scale of your organisation. Just a few things to think about. Might be any changes that you've made to your policies, plans, and processes. Anything that you've introduced in your programmes and activities. And that could be the theme of your activities, or it could be the way that you've been doing things. You might have attended training or development for your workforce. You may have done something big with advocacy and communication. You don't have to have done all of these things, something, that's all. And again, your answer will be scored out of 5, and it will be relative to the size of your organisation. So let's move on to the individual categories. I'm going to start by talking about categories 1 to 4. So these are the categories for pieces of work and projects, and they are innovation, collaboration, well-being, and healthy team. For each of these categories, you have a text box to fill in 500 words to describe some things. It all follows the pattern for each of these categories. We want to know about what you did, what happened, and the difference that's made. We didn't want to be prescriptive on the number of words you spent on each of these things. So that's why we've given you just one box, 500 words, to talk about your project in these terms. Okay. The different categories, 1 to 4, will have slightly different emphasis. So please go to the guidance document on the website and just check exactly what we want to know for each of these. For instance, When collaboration is asking you what you did, we want to know who you did it with as well. For a healthy team, when we ask what you did, we want to know why you did it. What was the need behind it? So if you are putting the same project in for a few different categories, you need to tweak your answers to make sure that they're consistent with what we're asking about the project for each category. The answers will be scored out of 15 by the shortlisters to get a top 3 that will go to the judging panel. The judging panel won't have access to the shortlisters' scores. They'll look at the shortlist of 3 and make a decision based on their own reading of your application. I won't go through the individual requirements for each. You can ask me about those anytime. Just to highlight a couple of things, though, that I would like to draw your attention to. In the innovation category, we ask about positive outcomes. And we also state that this can include your learning. We know when you're trying to do something innovative that things don't always go according to plan. If something's happened, it's not quite what you expected, but you took some learning as an organisation from it. And that learning is making your organisation stronger for the future. That completely counts as a positive outcome. So please don't be scared to say, this was all brilliant, this went a bit wrong, we weren't expecting this, but we've learned something from it. That's really valuable. I also just want to flag up for the healthy team section. When we're talking about team, we're talking about the entirety of your workforce. So that's staff, volunteers, and freelancers. I don't think we've ever specifically talked about freelancers before, but they're such a valuable part of our heritage workforce. We wanted to make sure that they were represented in the Heritage Awards this year. Okay, let's move on. Categories 5 to 7. So these are the people categories: the Heritage Heroes, Leader of the Year, One to Watch. Okay. Similarly, you'll have one box where you have 500 words to describe what they did and why you think they deserve the award, and what is the lasting impact of the work. So in effect, we're asking the same kind of things that I just outlined for the other categories. We're asking for what they did, what were the outcomes, and what difference have they made? And your score will be out of 15 again. It's really important just to stress, similarly as for the healthy team, for Heritage Heroes and Leader of the Year, this refers to any member of your workforce. So staff, volunteers, including trustees, and freelancers. One to Watch is limited to volunteers, to young volunteers, because we really want to celebrate their commitment to putting their time into heritage organisations. Again, in the guidance document, there are a few different tweaks that you'll need to make depending on the category. So please have a look at that and read it thoroughly. Please also tell the person or team that you're nominating before you put in an application. We'd love to think, I'm sure it would be a wonderful surprise for them if they've been shortlisted, but we just want to make people aware and make sure that that is in fact a wonderful thing for them. So the final category is category 8, Object of the Year. And this year we are focusing on climate stories. There's a few more questions to answer on the application form because of the way that Object of the Year is judged. We will take this out to public vote once it's been shortlisted. So the first thing that will be asked to provide is a short caption that will go on our website, and also a maximum of 250 words description of the object and its story. And these are the two things that the voting public will see. So in this section, you need to describe the object and its story and really capture people. Remember that you're writing for the public here. The shortlister will also read the story, obviously. But for shortlisting, we also want to know about your process, about why you chose the object, what you know about the object, and why you think that story is important. So this is a bit more about the behind the scenes work. So you have 300 words to describe what your relationship as an organisation is to the object, how you know about it. We also want to know what you intend to do with this object in the story. If you've already used it in an exhibition and you've already told that story to your audiences to influence them and change behaviour, that's brilliant. Tell us about that. We don't want to limit this just to objects that have been on display though. So if you see an object with potential, we want to know that you understand that potential and that you understand how the story can be used to influence behaviour in the future. Okay. So the shortlisting judge is going to be looking for evidence of an object which tells an engaging story. So this needs to be a story relevant to the climate crisis, relevant to human interaction with the planet, or environmental change over time. It's very easy when we think about climate stories to think, it's got to be a natural history collection. It's got to be something directly related to natural history, and that's not the case at all. We want to investigate stories about human interaction with the planet as well. It could be creative responses to the climate crisis over time. There is no limit on the kind of object you can submit for Object of the Year. It just has to have that compelling story and the potential to influence and change behaviour. And as I said, the judge will also be looking for your understanding of the relevance and importance of the object of its story. We want to know how you've done the research, what you know about it. And we want to know how you think that object and story can be used or has been used. Okay. So that was quite a brief roundup of the Heritage Awards eligibility, judging and categories. I hope that's been useful. In a moment, I'll hand over to Charlotte and we will do some more on actually writing the applications.
So thank you everybody for coming back and listening to this second part of the session today. What I'm hopefully going to do is just go through some top tips on writing applications. And this is useful for the Heritage Awards. Obviously, that's the context that we're doing this in, but it's definitely going to be helpful for you for other applications that you might need to write as well. So other applications for awards or equally fundraising applications. And I'm sure everybody is writing quite a few of those all the time. So I thought it would be useful before I go into it, just to give you a bit of context about my role at CMP. I don't necessarily have a huge amount of contact with museum staff and volunteers, so you might not have any idea who I am, and this advice may well be a little bit random if you don't know. So my focuses at CMP are sort of project development and fundraising, and I work with Steph and our other colleague Celine, who I'm sure you all know. So I do this quite a lot. I work mostly on our Arts Council fundraising, which is quite large pots of money, but also everything else that comes through CMP, right down to the small pots and things like sponsorship and donations as well. So hopefully you'll recognise the usefulness of some of the advice. It might all be things that you already know or already do, in which case, big tick and a nice piece of verification for you in terms of your practice. But there might also be a few snippets of new ideas or new processes that we can go through, which I hope will be useful. So I thought I'd start at the start and start by talking about preparation. Now, I do apologise for this cheesy quote, but it is true, isn't it? And I think we all know how relevant this is in terms of by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. I think we've all suffered from failure to prepare before. And there are going to be a couple of other funny pictures and quotes because we can't take everything too seriously. I think the most important step in applying for funding is doing the groundwork in preparation. And I know that this is sometimes the hardest bit to find time to do. I know that the automatic response is to kind of download the form, read the guidance and just start writing. But I'm a firm believer in the fact that if you can make the time to prepare, you will probably save yourself time with the writing and the editing later on. So I kind of start with these questions, which you'll see will have, you know, lots of similarities to the questions that Steph shared earlier in the guidance, in terms of what the judges, the Heritage Awards specifically, are interested in knowing about. But it's also a really good starting point for all of those other applications that you might be writing as well. And I like to do this work on a separate document or on a random piece of notepaper, away from the guidance and away from the funding or the application form, so that I'm not pulled into a certain tangent or a certain way of looking at my work by what the funder wants. I think it keeps us authentic to think about this separately. So you can kind of think about these types of questions. There'll probably be other questions you might want to think about. You know, what did you do, or what do you want to do? What difference did you make, or what difference do you want to make? I think the useful one here is, what problem are you addressing, or what opportunity will be seized? And I think that's a really critical question to be able to answer when you're writing a prospective funding application, but also useful when you're writing a retrospective application like the awards, to kind of think, you know, what did we really get to the nitty-gritty of by doing this work? Or what was the opportunity that we sort of seized and made happen because of what we did? And then, what change do you want to create? This can be really ambitious stuff when you're thinking on that first sort of setting out your stall. You know, you might want to run a engagement program with a community group, because the problem that you recognise is that your audience isn't as diverse as it could be, and there's a real kind of limit in terms of who is coming to the museum or who is coming under their own steam to the museum. And that change might be that you want to create a long-term partnership with that particular demographic or that particular organisation for a piece of work you know is going to happen 5 or 10 years in advance. That could be really ambitious, and you can always dial that back when you're writing your bids, but I think it's really useful to think about where you see this going and think big about the difference in the world that you could create, not just for your own organisation. Because it's those things that are really ambitious and can be quite exciting, that are going to catch the attention of the person that's reading it. And now I'm going to talk about the nitty-gritty of the work that we do when we're writing applications, and that is writing. And this is a pretty good example of, this image is a pretty good example of how I feel when I'm writing an application. It can feel quite a manic process, and I often flit between questions. But the notes that I've made at the start will really help guide that. And I don't think there's any getting away from how pressured that process can sometimes feel. But there's a few points that I want to run through that I think can really help you in terms of structuring that approach, a few tips in terms of making it an easier write for you, but also an easier read for whoever is reviewing it, and hopefully a more enjoyable process for everybody. So the first point I want to talk about is language, and I think it's really useful once you've gone through your sort of prep process to revisit the guidance and really highlight the words that they keep using. So a really great example of this is in the Heritage Awards when we've asked for collaborations. Now, a synonym of collaboration might be partnership, but for our shortlisters, they're going to be prepped to read about collaborations. And although we all know that those two words mean very similar things, it's simply easier for them to read about collaborations when they are looking to judge a collaboration category, and they have been briefed with the guidance which talks about collaborations. Now, this sounds really, really straightforward, but I think our instinct is to use as many synonyms as possible because that's kind of how we've been taught about writing properly. And of course, sometimes there is a need for a synonym. We don't want to be using the word collaboration 7 times in a sentence or 2, but I think there's a trick that you can use in terms of reflecting the either the award giver or the funder, their language back to them in the application that can really help with that sort of psychology of reading, and it will also make their job a little bit easier, which is of course what we want to do in terms of helping them make a decision in your favour. Similarly with this, I think subheadings are a real bonus and can really help both you and whoever is reading your application to identify how you've addressed the information that the grant holder or the award giver is really looking for. So earlier on in some of the guidance Steph went through, she said, you know, the things we are looking for in this are X, Y, and Z. And forgive me, Steph, because I can't quite remember exactly what those were, but it will be things like, what did you do? What difference did you make? And why did you do this? I can't quite remember what the third option was. It would be really, really helpful in the Heritage Awards, but also it'd be helpful in any other application you're writing for you to write those headings out and start answering those questions independently of each other. So in your box for your answer to that question, literally write yourself a heading, what did we do, and write about what you did. And then write yourself a heading, who did we work with, and write about who you worked with. Write yourself a heading, what was the difference, and write about the difference. And although it can feel a little bit unfinished, if you've got the words to spare, leave those subheadings in when you submit your applications, because it also really, really helps the person reading it to understand that you have addressed those 3 points, because they're going to be reading the same guidance as you, and that's how they're going to be judging what they've given you. So I think there's a bit of unlearning to do when we're writing applications around how we perceive, you know, good, well-structured writing to be. And there is absolutely a place for that if you're trying to convince or influence people. You know, good writing is really important. But I think there's also a lot of tips and tricks you can use around making something simple and making a decision easier for whoever is reading it. Because let's face it, if we have dozens or hundreds of applications to look at, some of us will know this from, you know, recruitment or job reviews when you're reviewing job applications. After the sort of 5th, 6th, 12th, 13th application, it gets harder to sort of see the wood for the trees. So if whoever is applying has done that hard work in terms of setting out, here's what you asked me to do and here's how I've done it, it just makes it easier. And it makes it a more straightforward process and makes you more likely to get the decision you want. On that point, bullet points are the absolute solution to many of your problems. And I can see how they would be really helpful given some of the guidance that Steph's gone through this morning. Don't feel like you have to write really long, complicated lists or big, long paragraphs of words. Quite often a funder will really want to know the bare bones and the sort of essentials of what you're doing. So it's really useful if somebody asks you, you know, what will you do? And you know you will recruit a freelancer, run community workshops, put a new display up in your foyer, and buy a laptop. That you could just write those 4 things out, and that would probably, you know, I'm not saying for every application that's going to be okay, but you can do that rather than write a paragraph that might take 3 or 4 times the amount of words and not be quite as clear about what you actually are going to do. So there are opportunities where bullet points can really help you in your sort of transparency and how you communicate in a really clear and explicit way. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about authenticity in your writing. And that speaks to what I was saying about what we think good writing looks like and what compelling writing probably is. And I think there's something to be said for not sort of dialing your organisation's personality back when you think about when you're writing. So I think there's a really important part of writing applications where you can be really proud of the work that you've done. You can be really excited about a project that you're proposing. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. At the end of the day, you want the person reading it to be proud of you, to award you an award, or you want them to be excited enough to give you some money. And they're going to feel that a little bit more when they know you can feel it as well. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with being emotional in your applications and using that to write a really compelling argument for why your work deserves the recognition of an award or funding. And then the final point I was going to make about writing was just the vitalness of review and redraft time. And I know you'll all know this. And similarly to preparation time, it's often the hardest time to find. I know I'm also the person who's always writing applications with hours to go instead of days to go. So finding this time is really hard. And you'll all know the importance and the value of having those critical friends, either in your organisation or outside of your organisation, who can review these documents for you. But I wanted to share a tip that I found really useful when I either don't have time to ask somebody to do it for me, or I'm just looking for an extra view. And that's a function on Microsoft Word that's called Read Aloud. And you can click this button and the computer will read out your document for you. And it's an accessibility function, but it really, really helps me to hear what I've written. And the only other option is for me to read it out myself. And I think there is a thing where you read your own writing a particular way. And although the computer's voice is quite robotic, it does help in terms of recognising, you know, repetition of phrases or sentences that just don't quite work. And that's a really, really helpful tool that you might not be aware of. So I definitely recommend looking at that if you can. So hopefully those 2 slides will have been a really useful overview of some of the approaches you can make for your Heritage Awards applications, but they are also useful for fundraising, like I said at the start. And I wanted to give a couple of extra points around particular fundraising advice that I wanted to share. And the first 2 are around budgets and how we set budgets. I think it's really, really important to be realistic in your budget setting. And I know that sounds really obvious, but I think often when we're writing for a funder, we think that we should do more with less. And often funders are now much more moving towards, we want you to do less better. Especially trusts and foundations who are independent of big institutions, they're independent of government. They can do within the remit of their charitable constitutions as they see fit with their investments. And I think you're much, much more likely to gain traction with them around work that looks expensive, but you know is really impactful. So there's something you can do around really talking about how much this costs and why it's important to you to do this work well and in a deep and meaningful way, rather than surface level, cheap, and sort of numbers heavy. Funders are much more interested in doing that deep investment work now. And I think the point to make here around contingency and core costs is about the cost of living crisis that we're currently experiencing, and just be really aware when you're writing applications at the moment that things are going to cost perhaps double what you budget right now by the time you get to a delivery programme. And funders are aware of this. So be really, really clear when you're writing your applications that you're giving yourself that wiggle room, or be really, really clear that you'll review your outcomes. So if you can't ask for more money, do less. And I think it doesn't always feel comfortable to talk to funders about doing less with more money, but they absolutely are up for it at the moment. And they recognise that things are costing more. They recognise that good work is not cheap. So there are, fruitful conversations that you can have with them when you approach these conversations with authenticity and honesty in terms of what you're really experiencing as an organisation. Fundamentally, the last thing they want to do is to fund you and for you to either not succeed or to cease to be able to deliver their work. So they are not going to want to fund an organisation who, because of that project, is unable to do other things. So that, the optics of that is terrible for them, but also the ethics of it is terrible. So be confident about having those conversations, and don't think that those funders are impenetrable in terms of reviewing and being, sticking to your guns with the money. And then the final point I wanted to make on this slide was around feedback and advice. And this is one of the most useful pieces of advice I've been given about fundraising. And it feels like a no-brainer to ask for feedback, but please do it, because not everybody will do it automatically. And ask for feedback when you've been unsuccessful, but also when you've been successful. It's really, really valuable for us who are writing these applications to understand from a funder, what was it about this application that made you want to invest in our organisation? What was the really compelling part of our writing, of our application? Was it the testimony? Was it how we talked really authentically about our partnership? Was it the values of our organisation? What bit really chimed with the board or the administrator that was making that decision? That is absolute gold for moving forward in a successful way. And then the other point I wanted to make was about advice. And this is something you can do for successful and unsuccessful applications, is ask the funding administrator or the grant manager, do you know of anyone else who's interested in funding this work? And it's easy to forget that those people on those email addresses belong to professional networks in the same way that we do. Those grant administrators, those grant managers will know other grant administrators and grant managers. So they might know that a similar trust and foundation has got a fund coming up that is primed to support your work, even if they haven't been able to. And the worst they can say is, sorry, we don't have any information for you. But there's been a few snippets of gold that I've been able to tease out of administrators over the years, which are just keep an eye on this funder, or why don't you ask this person? And that little sort of encouragement, sort of insider knowledge can be incredibly useful. And then the final thing I wanted to leave you with was this tool, which I call a project logic model. But it's really just a place for me to brain dump when I'm planning a programme. And I should have probably included it at the start, but I think it's always good to end on a resource. I fill this in when I'm answering those questions that I outlined in the preparation section. And this really helps me map out the bones of a project. So your inputs, if we're going back to that program we described where we were going to hire a freelancer, run a community engagement program, buy a laptop, and I can't remember the fourth thing I mentioned, those inputs would be freelancer time, community partner, laptop, and whatever that fourth thing was. Those activities might well be, you know, outreach with the community group, and then it might be a tour of the museum. And, you know, you can really sort of start to map out what is it within that project that are your activities. As you move through the columns, you can start to measure the difference that that project is going to make. So those outputs might be, you know, 6 community engagement sessions with that particular demographic at your museum over the course of a year. The outcome would be those community group members feeling more confident in visiting your museum. And then your impact could be something like long-term diversification of your audience, long-term partnership with this community group, contemporary collecting thanks to their understanding of society, you know, big ambitious things. Where this really comes in handy is in an application when a funder asks you, outline the outputs and outcomes of your project. And boom, you've got your list here. So you need to do some copy and pasting and some bullet points. And it's there, it's done. You might want to tweak things, of course, but actually you've done the hard work. So what I said at the start around preparation time really sort of paying dividends as you move through the process becomes really, really clear when you use this tool. So I wanted to leave you with this, and this table is actually in our Fundraising 101 resource, which is on our website, but it's quite straightforward, so you can just kind of make your own on Word or sort of do it on a little piece of paper. It's really, really handy, and it helps keep you sort of within the realms of what you wanted to do to start with. It's really useful to stop me going off on lots of different tangents when I'm writing a bid. So thought that might be a really helpful resource for everybody to know about as we move forward.